usually grow in clumps, and they absolutely cover the area. So this, I mean, the picture doesn't do it justice. It was just a ball of white here, there, and the entire plain was just covered with them. And, what's that? You know what? I always do check, but I can't remember. They probably didn't smell amazingly well because I don't remember. Oh, that's because it's white? Is that why you think? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I definitely didn't smell, even though the area was covered with them, it was not very fragrant. So, unless I'm just not sensitive to that. Another plant that covers that grows in clumps and basically kind of like transforms the landscape, makes it more fuzzy and and soft in appearance, is the Peruvian feather grass that is basically just ubiquitous at this elevation. And even though it's not a cactus, but I think it still looks really cool. And it's not dead, even though it does look dead at this point. Another plant that isn't a cactus, in fact, it looks a little like moss until Azorella compacta, until you look closer and discover that it is actually a flowering plant in the family Apiaceae, or the carrot family, if I remember correctly. So not very carrot-like, but it's the same family nevertheless. So we're done with the high elevation. We're going back to the coast. Taltal and Paposo again. And going back, there's literally like one main road, so inevitably we're going to be on the same road again. But even hiking, I often don't regret going back the same way because the angles are different. I often see things I missed, and now having achieved our goals, we were able to kind of relax and focus on other things. And even though we had already seen a bunch of Copiopoa gigantea and Eulychnia taltalensis, but it's the less conspicuous things that we were after this time. And we had basically time and the luxury to stop and search for something that can't be seen from the road. So I often mention, like just a few minutes ago, that cacti seem to be, most cacti seem to be specialized to living on steep slopes, even though it kind of seems counterintuitive because they're top heavy, full of water, and even growing tall. It doesn't compute. It's easy for a cactus to just rip off and fall. And inevitably they do that occasionally, but I think there is enough advantage of growing on steep slopes for them, avoiding competition, what have you, that they still do it. And interestingly enough, we can see it here because the erosion keeps just eroding this bank. And the cacti, this is just on its, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do, on its way down. At some point, it's going to slide. But what it offers me, in this case, it's a rare glimpse into their root system, because I often read in books and publications that cacti usually have very shallow root systems, and that is actually not what I usually see when I dig them up. However, those are usually plants that we planted in the garden or in somebody's backyard, someone planted. So they didn't germinate there. The environment is different, the soil is different, so you might say that's not a valid observation. This is more valid because this is probably at least a foot deep, and that's as far as I could see. There may be something slightly deeper. So the majority of the root system, of course, the tangled mess is going to be just under the surface. But they certainly go a little deeper, at least individual roots. And this is kind of a rare opportunity for me to see this kind of natural cross-section here. So this is what it looks like when you step back a little bit. It's pretty high, pretty steep. And like I said, it's just a matter of time before this Copiopoa comes down. But I guess such is life. Until it lasts, it's happy in flowering. And this is the cross-section through the hill, basically a road carved into the hill. Probably many thousands of cacti were destroyed in the making of this road, but again, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see the plant so easily. Down here, we have something that looks a little like a roadside weed, but it's actually a very interesting plant with a range of adaptations that makes it, it's a very adaptable plant is what I'm trying to say, essentially. It's a Nolana crassulifolia in the Solanaceae family. New to me, I didn't even know it existed. Trying to identify what it was a nightmare because all the South American species are kind of difficult to find. Any information about those plants is not as readily available as the North American plants. But the adaptations that allow it to thrive, especially at the bottom of the hills, like cacti kind of grow on the slopes like we mentioned before, and one of the advantages of that is that this soil gets kind of like rinsed, and there is less pollution, less heavy metals, less salts in their soil, because it all collects at the bottom, which is exactly where Nolana lives. And it's able to withstand that higher salinity. Not only that, but it actually, because it excretes that extra salt, that gives it the advantage of hygroscopic salt crystals. So there is a funny story because I have a rawhide that I tanned myself with salt only, and it hangs in my garage. And whenever the humidity rises up to maybe like 70% or something like this, it gets clammy and moist, without anything. So that kind of got me thinking, all it takes is a little bit of salt, and it basically absorbs water from the air. And it doesn't even have to be foggy, doesn't have to be rainy or anything. It's enough, humid enough in my garage for it to happen. So all those crystals here, sometimes it's got more, sometimes it's got less. They will readily absorb water from the, not just from fog, from humid air. And that's how this plant lives in. I've seen it in places where even cacti wouldn't grow. So that's probably higher salinity than cactus can tolerate, but at the same time, it's much better at absorbing moisture from the air. But that's not to say that cacti can't withstand drought. This was like the end of the long dry season. It never rained when we were there. Everything looked absolutely dry, but it didn't stop this Copipoa from flowering. In fact, here I am holding a detached arm or a stem that this must have happened a long time ago because there was no signs of like fresh damage or anything. It was all callous. There were absolutely no roots on this plant. I actually kind of dug a little hole and planted it. Maybe it will work, maybe not, but I helped as much as I could. But when you look at these two plants, this one is firmly planted and this one is completely detached, possibly has been for months, and they don't look that dissimilar. This looks absolutely happy, and it could probably go like this for, I don't know, another year, maybe even more. So, if you're gonna grow on a steep slope, you better be able to store a lot of water. And if you do, then who knows, this plant could root and be happy again. I'll probably never find out. And again, no rain, possibly for months, but here we have Copipoa forming a bud, and actually actively growing too. So maybe the fog is enough. Seedlings, don't be fooled by the size of these things. They're tiny, but it doesn't mean they're very young. They are probably still, I want to say, at least 5 to 10 years old. It just takes a little time for them to mature. And here we have, with potential parent plants in the foreground, these are the little seedlings behind them, or at least the relatives here in the foreground. So very healthy population. And these are probably pups or offsets. This Copipoa is known to do that, although I have seen seedlings germinating on the body of dead cactus. So I'm not entirely convinced that these aren't seedlings, but they don't have to be. They could just be offsets. And when we're talking about Eulychnia in habitat, we usually just see those old dilapidated grayish stems that don't look anything like what you can see in cultivation. So the only time Eulychnias in habitat resemble anything that we see in cultivation is when we look at a fresh young stems. This is what Eulychnia taltalensis looks like in people's greenhouses. I don't know how long it's going to look like this, but eventually it will turn into something like that, which is still pretty cool, but very different, and it doesn't make identification any easier. So, speaking of things that aren't exactly as conspicuous as the big Copiopoas or Eulychnias, Copiopoa humilis. I didn't expect that thing to be there. In fact, when I was taking this picture, I had no idea what this was. I thought, like, I'm going to identify it later, and that's exactly what I did. It is in that region, so, and it definitely looks like it. It's shriveled up, but the skin, the epidermis, even when it's, although it does get a little greener when fully inflated. So that's the problem with trying to identify these plants, you know, looking at pictures that people took in the rain season. They all look beautiful. They're kind of green and plump, and they look nothing like this. So it doesn't make it any easier. But I'm pretty sure this is Copiopoa humilis. It's supposed to be there. It looks like it. And here we have a genus, probably first Eriusaceae that I mentioned during, or the first Eriusaceae that I saw on this trip. Eriusaceae paucicostata, or the few-ribbed Neoporteria. So Brian mentioned before, so I'm not going to repeat that again, why we use Eriusaceae and Neoporteria interchangeably is because of the mess of classification here. There was a big lumping event that happened back in 1994, and most botanists kind of followed and agreed with that. Some still don't, but we basically lost, like, I think it's at least 20 genera. Well, not lost, but they're all included in the genus Eriusaceae now. But whether we agree with that or not, I'm just going to keep it as Eriusaceae just for simplicity. It just makes everything easier. And I'm not very familiar with Eriusaceae or the other genera like Neoporteria and so on. So this definitely proved challenging, especially finding plants looking like this. Not to the best of, you know, this isn't their best look, so to speak. But this one is actually, I mean, the spines are absolutely beautiful. So Neoporteria or Eriusaceae paucicostata. I also always like to take pictures of like this immediate surrounding area to kind of like go back and see where and how it grew. And here we see that, you know, the face of the rock, it definitely, this big rock basically just shades the plant for a significant amount of time during the day. So it definitely helps. It helped it as the plant as when it was a young seedling, certainly, and it definitely helps it now because it protects it from you know, losing too much water during hot days. And we're going back to the coast down to Pan de Azúcar National Park, one of the few national parks just open to the public no matter what, no matter the day of the week or time. There is no gate. You can just freely enter and drive right through it. So why not? And another plant that isn't a cactus, but intrigued me because I looked at it and immediately thought that I must have seen this somewhere, or something similar. And then later I looked at my pictures from the valley, and indeed, I did see something not only very similar, but exactly the same thing. The Stachys spicata, I believe that's how we pronounce it, I'm not sure, but it's the same plant, and it's not invasive. It just has an insanely wide range of natural occurrence, and it's very adaptable to whenever there is a little bit of salty soil that other plants can't really tolerate. There isn't much competition from other vegetation. It's hot, it's sandy. This plant takes advantage, and it grows all over the place including our Death Valley here and Chile. And here we have another Nolana on literally a vertical wall, sandy wall, Nolana divaricata. Close up, it looks something like this with ball-like spherical, very spherical leaves, presumably filled with water. It's clearly a succulent plant. And right next to it, we have, again, Nolana crassulaefolia, which is, like I mentioned, a very adaptable plant. And whatever makes this area this barren, there is absolutely nothing else growing there. Whatever makes this so inhospitable clearly doesn't bother this Nolana and doesn't stop it from reaching those epic proportions. This is like a small truck size of a plant, and there was maybe 2 more of those gigantic clumps. Nothing else grew there. This is clearly some dry wash. There must have been some water flowing through here some time ago, and presumably this is very salty and maybe just too salty for anything else, but Nolana just doesn't care. In fact, it doesn't care even if it's just on the, by the ocean. You know, all it has to do is find itself a rock that nothing else can grow on and absolutely cover it and just be happy. You know, it's a very adaptable plant. This is just a few miles away from the previous plant. Again, Solanaceae. I think the flowers kind of look like it. Slightly succulent, but I believe that, you know, that salt excretion definitely help it absorb that moisture from air, especially when it grows just by the ocean. There's lots of fog, and that's why it's just so happy and flowering. And this alien looking plant, proved extremely challenging. In fact, when I found it on Wikipedia as Polychirus fuscus, and the only information I was able to find about this was that it's a South American plant in the Asteraceae, which we can see looking at the dead flowers here. iNaturalist wasn't very helpful either. It's just a plant with 60 observations. That's it, and that's all I was able to find. So it remains a mystery, other than it's a very pretty and very strange plant with some hairs, some kind of trichomes on the leaves. It's clearly a succulent as well, unlike many other species in this genus. I believe this may be the only one that's so succulent, but as you can see, it kind of looks like a weird succulent fern, except it's a flowering plant. So moving away from the coast, kind of roughly 30 miles from Huasco, we're going now to Vallenar. And why this is important is because that distance changes the environment completely to something barren again. There's almost nothing growing except this Encilia canescens, which doesn't seem to mind whatever prevents other plants from growing there. It's, again, probably salinity, lack of water, and I suspect that the reason why it looks so good has something to do with it being so fuzzy. Again, the pubescence, I believe that's what it's called, helps with capturing moisture from fog. And I suspect it has something to do with this plant looking pretty decent even in the middle of the dry season, or the end of the dry season, which is even worse. And, you know, leafy plants may not be as good at storing water as something like a cactus, but they are definitely much better at capturing this moisture from the air because of the greater surface area. So it's kind of a trade-off here. And this is another one of those strange stories where we were driving down the highway, and there's kind of like a truck stop, but not really. It's just like a place carved out in the desert where you can stop. And it appears to be a plot of land owned either by the state or maybe a private plot of land. But there was a hole in the fence, and I did take advantage of that hole. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to take this picture or these pictures. This is Cylindropuntia tunicata, which is so well established in Chile that many people will probably say that this is a Chile native plant, but it isn't. It most likely comes from Mexico. It's also found in Texas in the Chihuahuan Desert, and it just, whoever brought it over must have been people. It happened such a long time ago that now this plant, Cylindropuntia being Cylindropuntia, very good at spreading and surviving, it's just everywhere there now. And being well armed like this certainly helps in surviving. And this is a very pretty stem with very saturated bluish green epidermis and beautiful spine. What a beautiful adaptation. This is a maturing fruit on the non-native Cylindropuntia. Sticking with opuntioids, we have a native this time, Cumulopuntia leucophea, one of those inconspicuous plants that you'd be happy to spot before you step on it, because it's not very easy to see it, but it can definitely stick to your shoe, sometimes even go through your shoe and let you know that it was there, whether you like it or not. And this is something special, which I didn't know at the time, such is the case with many other cacti. But I was just taking a picture of something that looked to me like a weird Eulychnia acida. And you know why? Even this map here shows that there is Eulychnia acida expected here, except I don't know when this map was created, but even when they were creating it, they knew that something's up because they said it's Eulychnia affinis acida from Vianar. So they already mentioned that something's going on here. And I believe this was in 2019. Enough evidence was produced to grant it status of a separate species. And now we have Eulychnia vianarensis, which differs from acida in the way that it grows by creeping down and then going back up again. It's a little smaller, a little different, but I believe the biggest difference is in its genetics. So here we have, it's a new species, apparently pretty rare, native or endemic to that area. Here it is with Tristerix aphyllus, again, the parasitic plant that we can only see when it's flowering. And we're going down south, back to Coquimbo region, and on my way north, I saw a bunch of Trichocereus echinopsis, looked from a distance. Let's just stick with Chiloensis for now. And I wanted to see them, but I wanted to see them properly. I thought, surely I will find some kind of nature reserve or national park where I can do this and take pictures of this plant without fences in the background or trash all over the place. But it never happened. And on the way down south, on the way back, a bunch of those parks which had these cacti in them were actually closed. So I thought, this is my only opportunity. I'm just going to stop here and take some pictures of this in this random place because these plants look amazing. And this is what I'm looking for, and I may not have another chance. So why do we have so many different genera here? It's Echinopsis scotsburgii or Trichocereus chiloensis subspecies scotsburgii. It could be Trichocereus or Leucostele. So the reason for that is, I skipped a little ahead too soon. Back in 2006, David Hunt decided to lump a bunch of different genera together into Echinopsis, but it kind of didn't make a lot of sense, and he later admitted that this probably wasn't the best idea because if we're going to lump this and this together, then we have to do the same thing with other genera, and all of a sudden we end up with one giant genus that basically encompasses things that aren't really that related to each other, or I'm not sure. It just didn't make sense for a lot of people, and even Hunt himself admitted that it's probably not the best idea. So we went back to Trichocereus, and that's what it was. You know, for people who deal with are like Trichocereus fans, or yeah, just deal with Trichocereus on the daily basis. They never lost this name, they never changed, but you can still find a lot of like books or websites going with Echinopsis. But later, probably like 2 years ago, I think it was, maybe not even that long ago, there was another, like a pretty definitive, or maybe more than one study that shows that this species, not only should it not be Echinopsis, it shouldn't even be a Trichocereus, it should be something else entirely. It should be called Leucostele. So now we have Leucostele scotsburgi or chiloensis, Leucostele atacamensis, trochelkii, and so on. So whether or not, whatever you decide to call it, you have to admit that it's a beautiful plant with massive stout spines, especially when they're growing, they look amazing. Later in life, the older plants, as it's often the case with older plants, the spines change. They become bristle-like, more flexible, softer, and give the plant kind of like fuzzy appearance versus this mean-looking thing. And for some reason, these decided to split their heads into two or even three, like here. So all these meristems are still actively growing. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but maybe that's just what they do. Here we have an older seedling, around 7 inches tall, I believe, and you can see the spines are, again, different stage of growth. The spines are much shorter, but still stout. You can see that the promise of massive spines is already there. And when looking at these two, they almost look like two different species, or at least subspecies. But I think this one is just a much older plant, because when you look closely at the bottom here, these spines still resemble what's going on here very much. It's just these are probably still younger plants, or at least I suspect so. And we are in a small town called Pichidangui, just by the ocean, with pretty cool plants all over the place. But of course, I just paid attention to this absolutely massive Trichocereus, or Leucostele chiloensis, which is probably like, if I'm 6 feet tall, so you could put another one, I'm sorry, on top of my head and then some. So this is probably, what, 15 feet tall or something like that. So I honestly have never seen a Trichocereus chiloensis this big before anywhere. Much less in its native habitat. So chiloensis, some of you may notice that it sounds kind of weird, almost as if it comes from the Chiloe Island, which is here, which is nowhere near this cactus's native habitat or range. And in fact, it is most likely a misspelling, a mistake, noticed by Scotsburg, who has a cactus named after him, the Trichocereus scotsburgi, or at least a subspecies. And he already noticed that back in 1950. But apparently, the rules allow this unless the original author corrects it himself, which never happened. And now we're stuck with chiloensis for some reason. Annoying, but what are you going to do? So this is another story involving a hole in the wall, because this nature reserve, the Parque Pucain de los Molles, was closed. Like most parks in Chile, outside of the height of the season, the parks are only open 3 days a week. So if you're there on, in the wrong time, you're out of luck. So there's literally like a wall and a gate, and there's no discussion. You're not getting in unless you drive around the city and you find a hole in the wall and you sneak through. Obviously, we weren't able to connect to the main trails or anything like that. We could only see them from a distance, but we took advantage of that little sliver of the park and just walked around and checked it out as much as we could without damaging anything, obviously. And the first amazing thing that we saw is a common weed, oxalis. I mean, it's probably not the oxalis that we know from our pots, because this one appears to be a little even succulent. There is some succulent stem here and some somewhat succulent leaves, and the flowers are actually really nice looking, even to somebody like me who doesn't care much about plants like this. But you have to admit, it's a stunning looking flower. Obviously, Sustante grandiflora, I think it's now reclassified as something else. I can't remember now the new genus. What is it? That's right, Calandrinia, yes. But I'm always amazed by this insane contrast, and I can literally see it. It's not just that my phone plays tricks on us. It's really, when you look at the flower, it's like, it looks as if it's just copied and pasted here from someplace else. It's so vivid, so like different, completely different color from everything surrounding it. And you know, the plants that we see often here look nothing like the Sustante or Calandrinia in habitat. You can see some, you know, the leaves don't look like what we know from the Bay Area, for instance. Most of the leaves I see on roadsides or in people's yards are just like massive, long and green, versus what we're seeing here. I mean, obviously this is dry season, so they're going to look a little stressed, but that's a completely different look. Like if you didn't know what it is, you probably wouldn't know what it is. Very stressed, red and shriveled up, which obviously doesn't stop it from flowering. And right next to it is growing another Eriaceae subgibosa. This one I'm pretty sure I identified correctly because it's one of the tallest ones with fuzzy spines. So I'm not very good at that, but some of them were fairly easy. So with this one, I'm also fairly certain I got the right one, even though it's one of the most endangered species of cactus in the world. And but the reason for it is, funnily enough, it's not because it's rare in that place. In fact, it's actually all over that area. The problem is, it's only that area where it exists. And it's a very small plot of land, so if something were to happen to its natural habitat, it would be gone. So that's the problem, but it's critically endangered. There are two varieties. It's the albiflora with white flowers, and there is kind of like reddish, pinkish flowers too. We didn't see any of the flowers, unfortunately, but we did see the fruits, which also help confirm that this is most likely that species. That and the stout dark spines, to the best of my abilities, I think that's what it is. And here we have an example of why identifying, you know, Eriaceae can be very difficult. I believe these are all the same species, and they look very different depending on their age. Like something like this here or this here, you know, if I didn't know any better, I would probably suspect that this is Copiopoa with all the spines lost at the lower stem here. You can see how this very much resembles a Copiopoa. The only problem is there are no Copiopoas there. So in this case, I suppose it's not a problem because it made the identification easier. And obviously we have Nolana crassulaefolia because it's everywhere, and Sustante or Calandrinia. Here is an example of young Eriaceae subgibosa, and you can see how different it looks. This is not the fuzzy spines that we see on the mature plants. Here we have an example of what happens when a fruit or a bunch of seeds get washed into a nice little crack and find a little bit of fertile soil, and they all germinate and they kind of grow into this nice little cactus nursery in the crack. Probably the smallest Eulychnia seedling that I saw on that trip or ever in habitat, Eulychnia castanea, the smallest one. Here it's older relatives, And the plant itself, like these plants are much longer than this picture would lead you to believe, because they kind of droop and creep along the ground and then come back up. So the stem itself can be 3 times as long as what you can see here. It's kind of, there's a bunch of different species of cactus that do that, including some Trichoceres or Echinopsis or Lobivias too. Here we have something that's Carpobrotus chilensis. It's so well established in Chile that it got its name from the place, but unfortunately, most likely, like most mesons, it does come from South Africa. It's also widely distributed in California, on the California coast, which is another reason why I think the coast of Chile is very similar in some respects to the coast of California. We have a bunch of Carpobrotus on both coasts. And Cystante grandiflora, like I mentioned, the dry season does not stop it from flowering. It must be something to do with the fog and the proximity of the ocean. Here we have another Trichoceres, or Leucostella, if you will, Chiloensis subspecies littoralis, or so I suspect. That's what everybody says what this is, and I will not argue with people who claim to know better, because I've seen many different plants called the same thing, but looking very different. And the only reason I mention subspecies in the case of these Trichoceres is because sometimes they are considered separate species. So you might find it called Trichoceres littoralis or Trichoceres scotsbergia or Trichoceres something or another. And I'm just going to stick with the subspecies because I'm not sure if they're different enough. I don't have a horse in this race, so I'm not going to argue with anybody. But this is what it looks up close and personal. The spines are pretty short, not as stout, but not very thin either. And these plants didn't seem to branch very much, which will be important later. Another thing, remember when I said that Eulychnia castanea is longer than it looks at first glance? These are the long stems that creep along on the ground, and then once in a while they will just like pop up again and kind of like create this thorny or spiny bush. But this here, I'm not very good at identifying puyas, I will be honest. This is, but the thing that made it a little easier was the fact that that area is only known to have 2, maybe 3 species of puya, one of which has straight and upward pointing leaves. The other one is Puya alpestris. So it must be chilensis. Even though I didn't see the flowers, we only have the dead inflorescence here. The flowers are kind of, I think, yellowish, but Brian mentioned that it may be kind of greenish yellow. So obviously, we're not going to see the flowers in this case. So here it is. Eriosyce mutabilis also made it easier for me, because when you look at the, if I was going to go by like the color of the epidermis and the number of spines, it's like really difficult to count anything here or see anything, because it's obviously very shriveled up and kind of dried up. You might be excused for thinking that this plant is dead, but this is the only Eriosyce in the area with stout spines, and the only one that grows kind of flattened stem. There is something about it that makes it stand out. This one, for instance, you can see that through this palisade of stout spines, you can see a bunch of seeds, so it definitely flowered last season, still alive. This one looks a little better because it's hiding under a bush, and those elongated red fruits were also helpful in identifying the plant. I didn't see the flowers, but the fruits are sometimes different enough that you can tell what it is. Plus, like I mentioned, it's the only Eriosyce flat, squat one with very stout spines in that area. So I'm pretty sure I didn't make a mistake in this case. Eriosyce subgibosa, like I mentioned, softer spines, a little taller, very pretty plant. Very pretty cactus. And I decided to include this picture here with this bucket there because up until this point I was under the impression that, like, to me this was all special. You know, this may as well have been like a nature reserve or whatnot, but to the locals they just don't care that much. This is another place along the ocean, and they'll just throw a piece of trash here and there, and it's kind of a reminder that these people just live with these plants day in, day out, and it's nothing special to most of them. It is special to me, though, especially this beautiful patch, a massive patch of Eulychnia castanea, which basically just, they cover this ground here. I would not want to wade through that sea of spines. Up close you can see how many there are. And fortunately, they don't seem to be very much disturbed. This is a little further south, outside of the nature reserve now. So it's nothing special to the locals, but you know, who wants to fight a cactus, and why would you? So they just live there undisturbed. So we're going further south to Valparaiso now, and this is getting closer to the metropolitan region where Santiago de Chile is, from where we flew out and back home. But before we did that, we saw another very characteristic, very special Ericaceae horrida, which is not mutabilis. And the reason I know that is because Ericaceae mutabilis does not occur in that area. So again, the ranges did not overlap, which made it easier for me to tell them apart, because these have very similar features or traits, rather. They have both stout spines and kind of flattened bodies. They look very much alike, you know, except there is some differences in the shape of their fruits. Like in this case, you can see kind of like a roundish apple-shaped fruit versus those elongated ones. But again, because the ranges don't overlap, it was a relatively easy job. Here we have an example of the Ericaceae growing side by side with Eryngium paniculatum, which I thought was another one of the bromeliad. But then I asked Brian, and he says, this is absolutely not a bromeliad. Let me see the flowers. And it's a very pretty, I mean, for somebody like, maybe you know better than I do, but to me, this definitely looks like it could be a bromeliad. But then when you look at the flowers, that definitely is not a bromeliad flower. So it's, in fact, that's not what I wanted to do, I'm sorry. How do we go back? There we go. We go back. Let's go back here. It's another one of the carrot family member. So, like we mentioned before, that mossy-looking thing, this is its relative. Doesn't look anything like it, but you know, adaptation. They are softish. They are somewhat succulent, but very little. It's kind of like, yeah, it's definitely not super thick leaf. But it does appear to be somewhat succulent. And here we have another one of the two major species of puya in the area. This species I actually know somewhat decently from the Ruth Bancroft garden, because we have at least one specimen in there. So it kind of resembles it. You see the droopy leaves, they don't point upward. There's multi-headed, a bunch of multi-headed plants. Obviously, I couldn't see the flowers, which would have made the whole IDing job much easier. But nevertheless, out of the two, Chilensis versus Alpestris, I'm pretty sure this is Alpestris. And we can see some Trichoceres chiloensis subspecies littoralis in here as well. At least I think that's what it is. No, I don't think there was. In fact, in some of the pictures you can see some rodent scat here and there, like here. I don't know if gophers are a thing in Chile, and even because this is probably rabbit poop here, and even they are introduced, an introduced species, an invasive species. So I'm sure they do cause damage, but they aren't even supposed to be there. I don't think, I saw a bunch of holes in the ground, but I couldn't tell you what it was, and it definitely didn't look like those gopher mounds or holes. Yeah, that makes sense, especially in the mountains. I know that they do have some weird-looking rodents or lagomorphs, so the rabbit relatives. But I don't believe I saw any of those. They are either they were probably hiding very well, or maybe they're just nocturnal. That's also a possibility. Okay, so I'm going down. There we go. Okay, I probably found the right button this time. So here we have a nice combo of Eryngium paniculatum and Ericaceae subgibosa right next to it here, hiding. It definitely, I don't know which came first, so I couldn't tell which helped which. But it's most likely, I don't know how long Eryngiums can live, but if they live long enough, this one could have helped the little Ericaceae seedling here at some point. But like I mentioned, Puya alpestris, all over the place, especially on the slope facing the ocean. And even up close here and personal, you can see those long droopy leaves, which, I mean, in my mind, there is no doubt that this is Puya alpestris, which I definitely didn't expect to see there. This is one of the Puyas, or the Puya that I know, and here it is. What a coincidence. So this is another plant that many people labeled in that area as Trichoceres chiloensis subspecies littoralis, and I'm not going to argue with them. However, when you look at these spines here, and if we go back to Los Moyes specimen, which people say it's the same thing, I have my doubts. So I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be using, like I said, the subspecies names, except sometimes people consider those as separate species. So that's why I went there. But definitely very different spines. And it's not like this is a young plant and those spines will change. This is a relatively large stem and they are just different. But ironically, this resembles what we know and have in the garden as Trichoceres littoralis, more so than the previous one. Still not the same, because the spines on that specimen in the garden are still much more fuzzy and kind of bristle-like. So another surprise, something that looks almost like a mesem with very nicely red-tipped, somewhat succulent leaves, but flowers like a buckwheat. Is because it is a buckwheat. Coryzanthe novoana from the Polygonaceae family. And you can't really see how cool this plant looks when you zoom out too much. You'll really have to get in its face to kind of appreciate the flowers and the leaves. But it's a very cool, succulent buckwheat. And I always like to see cacti hiding under rocks like this. This is almost a perfect roof. And I imagine that later, as this plant grows, it will probably hit the roof and start pushing out and around the rock. And later, it'll probably just like clear out of that. You won't even know that it was ever growing under a rock. So it's always cool to see how seedlings start out. Some aren't as lucky, but this one, I believe, is still alive. It just doesn't have as much protection, and it's on its last legs, but it's definitely the smallest cactus that I saw on that trip. What's that? That's my finger. That's my index finger. So it's less than an inch, definitely less than an inch. So hopefully it survived, because I heard that after we came back, like a couple months later, they received quite a bit of rain. So this thing hopefully pumped up and is still pushing. And you know, I was going to close this now, but then I looked at this Erisaceae here, and I remember that one hiding under a rock, and I realized this is exactly what must have happened in this case too. There must have been a seedling hiding under this rock, and eventually it pushed out from under it, and now it looks like, you know, nothing ever happened. It's just a cactus growing out of a rock. So this is all I've got for you tonight. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time.